Boker Tov and good morning. I'm Rabbi Steve Moskowitz, and this is Monday Musings, a 15-minute spiritual kickstart to the week, in which I'm joined by friends and colleagues, and sometimes children. My daughter, Shira Yael Moskowitz, is joining us this morning to teach us something and to offer some insight. So let me tell you a little bit about Shira. I got my notes so I don't forget about my daughter's accomplishments. Shira Yael Moskowitz is the daughter of Susie and Steve.
Great name choice, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We thought long and hard about that. It means Song of the Mountain Goat, for those who may wonder about the Hebrew. Anyway, Shira is a graduate of the University of Michigan. Go Blue.
Go Blue.
Go Blue. She worked for 2 years at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life in Jackson, Mississippi, and she is now the co-creator and co-host of Counter Programming with Shira and Ariel. What is it, like a counter COVID pandemic?
A COVID distraction cast is the word coined.
COVID distraction podcast. It's quite funny. I would encourage people to listen to their podcast. So when's the next episode coming out, Shira?
We're going to release our trailer for season 2, probably this week. And then it's the real official season launch is going to be March 3rd.
Oh, that's great. You should show everyone your podcast official microphone that you have there. So look at that. Wow. That looks very official. All right, Shira, it's great to have you on. And I wanted to have Shira on the show because I get to see her, which is really wonderful and exciting. But some years ago, Shira traveled with fellow Michigan alum to Rwanda to learn about the history of the genocide there in Rwanda and how, in particular, the country's citizens are confronting that genocide. So, Shira, tell us about that trip, how it came about, and a little bit about it first, just to start us.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me this morning.
Of course.
Truly an honor.
Yeah, we haven't had you guys do too much for our congregations over the years.
No. It comes with the rabbi's daughter job. Part of my role and responsibilities.
Very nice.
I went to Rwanda in 2015, so almost 6 years ago now. It was right after I graduated college, and it was with a group of students from a class on corporate social responsibility. And so it was really through the business school. It wasn't a community service trip or anything like that. We were meeting with business leaders. And in order to understand any country's economy, you have to understand the history of that country, the culture of that country, as you would any country. And so, of course, when we visited Rwanda, it had been about 21 years since the genocide had occurred there. And that was a big part of what we learned about. And I had only been 1 year old when the genocide actually took place. So even though it was recent history for me and all of my classmates were around my age, for us, it still felt really distant, and it unfortunately hadn't been something that we learned about in school. And I think the part that I feel is really unfortunate is more the way that Rwanda handled the aftermath of the genocide that I wish we had learned about, because I think there are so many lessons there.
Learned about, when you're saying learned about just growing up in high school and in school here in the United States?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of focus on bad things that happen in school. And also, I understand there's so much world history to cover. And, sometimes I think we're living through history, it feels like every hour right now. And how will students ever learn about all of this? Will 2020 just be, and I guess 2021, will that just be one paragraph in a textbook?
Yeah, I know. Seems a lot longer than a paragraph now, doesn't it?
Living through it does not feel, it feels like I want a separate class on 2020 to 2021 for students. It's world history, AP US 2020. But like I knew that a genocide had happened there, but I feel like that was kind of all I knew. And I didn't get to learn about the really powerful post-genocide, how Rwanda came together after that. And I think that's what really stood out to me.
Well, tell us more about that piece in particular, because I remember you sharing that with us, and it still really resonates with me.
So when we would go to museums, they would, cover the basics of the fact that like the Hutu majority murdered their Tutsi neighbors as part of the genocide. But throughout the country, no one there was speaking about whether or not they were a Hutu or a Tutsi. Everyone referred to themselves as a Rwandan. So that was the first thing that really stood out to me. Like, wow, like it's only been 20 years, but they have fully moved past these, categorizations that all of these are social constructs. Everything is made up on what these different categories mean. We're all human. And they had moved past that. And, there had been an extremist government. It was a pretty atrocious genocide. I don't even know the number off the top of my head, but so many people were murdered and families were separated and uprooted. But everyone had decided as a country to move forward. And the way that they moved forward was through remembrance, which I think, Yizkor for us as Jewish people, remembering is really important.
Go Rabbi's daughter.
Yeah. That you sent me a shechter for many years. So your money was worth it.
Throw the Hebrew words in there. Thank you, Shira. I'm sorry.
Remembrance is really important to us too. But I think what I was so impacted by in Rwanda was that they, instead of just remembering, they said, like, how do we move forward as a people? What do we need? And the answer was accountability. And I think the reason I've been thinking about my trip to Rwanda right now is listening to a podcast with Brene Brown, who, if you don't listen to her Unlocking Us podcast, if you haven't watched her Netflix special, I can't recommend her more. I made you watch the Netflix special this summer. And she was talking, it was her On My Mind episode after the insurrection at the Capitol. And she was talking about, she's a shame researcher for anyone who doesn't know. And she was talking about how she was like, I wish shaming people could work, but it doesn't. I understand your need to want to shame people who stormed the Capitol, but that doesn't bring us forward as a country. It's not going to unify us. It's really, accountability is the only way forward to unity. And I think that, and she referenced Rwanda actually as one of her examples when she was in this episode. And I was like, wow, that is what it was. It was accountability. And I was, reviewing some notes I had written about my trip to Rwanda and looking over some articles, and they had held these gacaca courts as a form of collaborative justice. And so essentially there was too many trials for perpetrators of the genocide to be held in like the traditional court system. I think the stat was it would have taken them 200 years to try everyone. And obviously, like that's...
You mean everyone as an individual?
Yeah, all of the perpetrators of the genocide. And right. So what they did was they had these kind of open air courts that victims' families could attend, and the whole community would attend them, and people got shorter sentences because they also, if it was going to take 200 years to try everyone, you have to imagine there wasn't a lot of jail space either. And so people got shorter sentences if they, actually like said what they did and confessed, and then if they sought forgiveness of the victims. And so they had to
wait, their sentence was reduced if the victims forgave them, or if they just sought forgiveness.
I think it was a combination. It was that everyone wanted to move forward, and it wasn't just saying like, oh, I'm so sorry. It was like really asking for forgiveness and saying
and owning what you did.
Owning what you did, admitting it, and not just saying like, I was part of this community that perpetrated a genocide against you. It was like, I as an individual killed your husband, and like saying that to the person whose husband you killed, and I am sorry that you no longer have a husband. And like not just saying this as like a big ambiguous, like I was on this side, you were on that side, like this is what I did and this is how it impacted you. And that was my,
that was the formula in a sense.
I think so. That was my understanding. I am definitely not an expert on this, but that's
no, it's very helpful.
I left with. And one of the places that we visited was a reconciliation village, which is they're developed by the UN. I believe they're in other like post-conflict countries as well. I can really only speak to my experience of having been to one of the reconciliation villages in Rwanda. And in the village that we went to, we heard from a woman who spoke about her experience losing her entire family in the genocide at different points throughout. And then, as she finished her story, this man started speaking, and he talked about having murdered her family and how he was going, part of their commitment in being in this village was that he would look out for her and he would help her. And they were part of the same, community. They're in the same neighborhood. And when something broke in her house, he would go over and help her fix it. And
she let him into her house in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, they had reconciled for lack of a better word. And I just feel like everyone in our class was sitting there very shaken that day. Like it was this really positive and beautiful moment, but like, it was unfathomable to us to imagine like that level of forgiveness.
Yes.
And so I think it was overwhelming, I think, to process. And when we entered the village, there was all this singing and dancing and this beautiful ceremony to greet us. And we were I actually remember my professor in particular, he just sat there so shocked. Like it was so hard for all of us to process. And then you're thinking on all the things that you haven't forgiven people for on a smaller level, and things that, as a society, we've really struggled to forgive. And I do think the reconciliation villages are the highest level of forgiveness. To like live in that village, it's one thing to forgive someone and say, we have to move forward as a country. We have to remember and hold people accountable.
Can I just, so this reconciliation village,
mm-hmm.
Someone who was a victim and lost family members in the genocide is now a neighbor with someone who murdered potentially even his or her own family.
Yeah, that was my understanding of it.
And they're now neighbors, living together in the same village.
Yeah.
And that in your estimation is how Rwanda has, that on a larger scale is how Rwanda has moved forward.
Yeah, I think it really is a combination of people were held accountable. And so I think that people feel like as a society, they received justice. And people
held accountable, meaning that they received punishments.
I think some people definitely received punishment and jail time. I mean, I also think, and this was a lesson you guys taught me growing up, you have to own your mistakes. And like, sometimes, a timeout isn't actually what makes you feel the punishment, but having to call someone and apologize for your mistakes. We don't need to go into my high school shenanigans, but I mean, I think that sometimes not everyone has to be given a timeout and taken out of society. Sometimes having to admit to someone else that you did the wrong thing is just as powerful, and saying, here's how I'm going to be better. And I think that the country has done Rwanda has done an incredible job as well of commemorating the genocide. The museums we went to were incredibly powerful, but we also went to a church where like a grave, and it brought back a lot of feelings to visiting Auschwitz, which was a trip I had taken in high school. So it was that similar level of in these beautiful villages, and Rwanda is a beautiful, beautiful, like hilly, mountainous country. There are these really tragic mass graves, and all over the city there were billboards that said Kwibuka, which means remember. And like, it is really the accountability and the remembrance are a huge part of their society. And I think it's why they've been able to move forward. And there's so much we as a country can learn.
I want to highlight something and ask you for some clarification. I mean, I know that you were saying you visited Auschwitz, and so that there was comparison. Sometimes I feel that we focus more on the remembrance side, and we can almost get, you'll forgive me for putting it this way, or people will forgive me for putting it this way, stuck in the remembrance. But what part of the example that you're illustrating is that it's really, in order for the country to move forward, it's both remembrance and forgiveness and accountability. I mean, there has to be both sides have to say we're willing to move forward together.
Yeah,
I don't know where that part came from there. I mean, that's the most unbelievable piece.
Yeah, that was definitely something that really stuck out, because one of the people I traveled with was one of my dear friends from college, who was also Jewish, and her grandparents were actually Holocaust survivors. And we were so struck by the response felt different. And we are not first generation survivors, which everyone we met in Rwanda was pretty much a first generation survivor.
Who experienced it in some way.
Yeah. And we're not that for the Holocaust. And the response still that we, as like a bit more distant of to that atrocity, we felt that maybe the forgiveness piece wasn't as big a part of our community. And that there are still people who won't buy German products, or Jewish people who won't buy German products. And I don't want to tell people what to do, but it was something that just stuck out to us as, why is this different? And I don't think the accountability was there in the same way. Obviously on a high level there's been accountability, but
not in the ordinary person was not held accountable.
Yeah. And so maybe that is part of it, and that's something that I think we need to think about as a society, that it's different right now, but there is a lot of tension. Brene Brown was talking about the dehumanization and how that kind of led to the Rwanda genocide, and how that also, that doesn't help us right now. And that's something that we're kind of falling into, that trap of dehumanizing people who don't agree with us. And how do we as a country, we have a new president, it feels like in some ways we've turned a page, but it also, there is more work to be done in holding people accountable, and also forgiving and choosing to remember and move forward and take that remembrance and honor that remembrance into a new moment.
So to say a little bit more, because I was looking at the clock and we do have to sort of wrap up, like you said, you've been kind of going back through your notes this past summer, and I assume in terms of the Black Lives Matter and the protests, and sort of the awakening that many of us have experienced this past summer. I mean, how has that trip to Rwanda informed, where you're at right now as an American?
Yeah, I think it's just made it so clear to me that we can't just move on. And I think that's been a trope that I've heard from some people, that we just need to move on. It's a new time. We're just going to move on. And I think that people in our country have been suffering. Black people in particular have been suffering for a very long time, and moving on and saying we're going to be better, it's not going to fix the problem. And it doesn't, it simply, there's no way to erase the trauma of the past 400 years, but we have to hold ourselves accountable, and we have to remember that as we try to start moving forward. We can't simply move on.
Yeah, I would add, because one of the things that really became so clear as you were describing your trip to Rwanda, is that there seemed to be a willingness on both sides, like we're going to move forward together. And I don't think we're there at that point in our country. The willingness to say, okay, we're in this together. We're all Americans. How are we going to be one country? We're not at that moment.
Yeah. And I do think that is a leadership thing as well. And there was an interview I was watching recently about Rwanda and about Kwibuka, and they were saying, like, we all acknowledged we had an extremist government at that time, and it wasn't necessarily like people did perpetrate this genocide and they need to be held accountable, but there is an extremist government in place, and how do we don't have that now. Let's move forward together, holding each other accountable for what happened, and really remembering that as
I think that's,
we move into this hopefully new chapter, and hopefully that it can be a new chapter for America.
Yes, I think that's great hope for the future. And so people have now seen a little bit of a glimpse of what conversations are at our table in our house. So Shira, I want to thank you. You know what? And I'm going to also, that video that you're referring to, that clip, I think we'll post it. I'll put it in the comments to this Monday Musing so people can see it and watch it, because I think it is very powerful.
Yeah.
So Shira,
I'll share a few. I can share a few articles and stuff with you.
Okay, that'd be great. No, we'll post them as well. So Shira, thanks so much for being on Monday Musings. I'll of course send the honorarium in the mail. Thanks.
I thought I was going to be the funny Moskowitz sibling, but we ended up having a very serious conversation.
I know, we had you guys on we can have you to do your comedy routine. I didn't mention that Shira also does stand-up comedy.
And it's very good for the synagogue circuit.
Yes, you got those synagogue jokes down. So thank you, Shira, for being on and for sharing. That trip, I think, is really unique, and it's really quite instructive of where we're at in the moment in history that we're presently in. So it's always great to see you. I look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. Monday Musings, next Monday, 9 a.m.